I'm Matt Hagman, and this is Opportunity Miami, a podcast about people and ideas shaping Miami's economic future. Bit by bit, Miami is leaning into a net zero future, whether it's more electric cars and buses on the road or producing food in more sustainable ways. But what's the context? After all, this is a global transition to decarbonize our economy. To understand the big picture and to help break it all down, we have Vijay Vaitheeswaran, Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor for The Economist, joining us on the podcast. Vijay Vaitheeswaran, welcome.
Great to be with you.
So, want to start with this whole idea that the transition to net zero being a generational business opportunity. You know, that Larry Fink, of course, wrote earlier this year, the BlackRock CEO wrote earlier this year that the next 1,000 unicorns won't be search engines or social media companies. They'll be sustainable, scalable innovators, startups that help the world decarbonize. Is this the future as you see it?
So I look at the future with eyes wide open, and I see a couple of things. One is, as I argued 20 years ago, that climate change, you'll see a book over my shoulder called Power to the People, and it covers stories in The Economist I wrote at that time, arguing that climate change is serious and will transform the global economy. Some will find opportunity, and others will find that this is the end of the road for their industries and companies. And so it's a double-edged sword. And so now 20 years on, clearly the world has woken up. The investing world has woken up in terms of ESG investing and so on, but also companies, corporates are feeling pressure from below, from their employees, from customers, from suppliers, and from, of course, from investors and owners saying, what are you doing about this risk to our business? Can you turn it around and at least be presentable? Don't be toxic. And maybe can you find opportunity as well? I think we're at that inflection point. And so, yes, I think there are huge kinds of climate tech unicorns that are in the making at the moment. This is a moment of, you can see it as a Cambrian moment, an explosion of new kinds of creatures that are emerging. Not all of them will survive, but that's okay. That's the nature of innovation. However, I do caution that there will also be some dinosaurs that stick by their old ways. You know, it was in the 1860s and 70s that the internal combustion engine emerged out of the center of Europe and then ultimately mass manufactured by Ford in America 30, 40 years later. But well into the new century, people were still making money selling buggy whips for horses, right? So there are industries, but they'll be dying industries and legacy industries. And there may be the last drop of oil being sold by the Saudis 50 years from now. But let's see what's a sunset industry and what's a sunshine industry. And you have to keep your eyes wide open as we look at opportunities looking ahead.
But as we sort of look across our economy, is it fair to, you think back, it was 10 years or so ago when Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, wrote that piece in the Wall Street Journal about how that software is eating the world. And essentially arguing that technology is invading, most, if not every corner of our economy. In a way, are we now in a place in what you're describing there that we could almost change software or tech for climate, and that whether companies like it or not, and even as some companies may be slow to change or not change at all, that climate will be having an impact on companies in every corner of our economy going forward?
It already is, and that's certainly true. This is one of the mega trends of this century. And we're well into it now at this point, a fifth of the way through this century, where we have seen that the impacts of climate, the early and sure to get worse in many ways impacts of climate will be felt, but also that we're seeing consciousness, awareness in the political systems and among consumers and among young people under 35, consistently tell things, even at business school, the most profit-minded of young people go to business school, at Harvard Business School, Stanford Business School. When I've spoken to the deans, I've written about this on the pages of The Economist, they say they demanded changes to the curricula at these hyper-capitalist schools that turn out titans of industry, because they said, you don't have enough green accounting courses. You're not teaching climate change in a serious way. At HBS, they completely revamped the first-year curriculum with a huge sustainability and climate focus and thinking about purpose. And so these are the future, Fortune 100 bosses, at least in their own minds. Harvard has a record of turning them out from business school. They demanded changes in the curriculum, and we see this at companies as well, that the younger employees are demanding the companies take these issues seriously. Now, the Andreessen software analogy, I think it's a good one. Climate is that issue encroaching on it. But let's remember, the old economy can bite back as well, right? Hardware, things you can drop on your foot are still with us, right? Software can accomplish a lot. But what we really need, and the reason why the limits of the software revolution, the internet didn't change everything, is because we still need factories. We still need to make things. And so that's kind of what's really happening today, is an industrial renaissance in America, a return of made in America. But if we do it right, we'll do it a smarter way. We want to build the factories of the 21st century, which are embedded with AI, machine learning, Internet of Things. They're fused together and maybe in a distributed fashion with additive manufacturing, 3D printing, right? To extend that analogy to energy, of course, climate is going to be a forcing function and create opportunities, maybe push some industries out of business, like the dirtiest of coal plants and so on. However, we see with this energy shock around the world at the moment, and Europe most notably, but around the world, that the old economy still bites back. We're seeing a need for keeping the lights on to keep granny from freezing in winter, and that's leading to old forms of energy continuing to be extended. Even in California, they want to extend the life of nuclear power plants, as in Germany, where it was verboten to talk about nuclear. They're extending the lives of nuclear plants, as well as coal plants are being turned back on around the world, because simply going on the climate agenda is not going to get you everywhere. You have to be able to achieve what energy nerds call the energy trilemma. That is, environment and climate, yes, but also economics and affordability for the ordinary person, and ultimately security and reliability. You got to get all three right. And that's a lot harder than just coming up with some software app that two guys in a garage come up with in Silicon Valley. So Andreessen's only got it part right.
To pause and hover over what you just said, in the context of, say, a Miami business leader, whether it's a mid-sized business or a larger but South Florida focused enterprise, climate needs to be in the agenda. I mean, it is going to have an impact on his or her company, one way or the other going forward.
No
Fair
doubt.
to say?
Absolutely, no doubt.
No doubt.
And particularly in South Florida, in part because in a way, geography determines destiny in this case, right? South Florida is a vulnerable part of America, of the world. And if you just look at the lower 48 states, lower Florida is probably one of the most exposed places. The good news is it's also a place that has the economic resources to be resilient, to invest in resiliency, as well as has a lot of financial capital and technological capital to innovate. And I saw this on a recent visit to Miami, where I got to meet a number of the climate and tech entrepreneurs and was quite impressed with the attention that's being brought to this by public policy, by officials in the area, but also by the tech ecosystem that's evolved in recent years that can help with that innovation. You have to be resilient. You have to be quite agile in coping with this, because the change will come in ways we can't entirely predict. We know models are flawed, right? They can only give a notional direction of more intense storms, rising sea levels, but the particulars will matter. And there'll be things that we hadn't thought through in old building codes, let's say, or materials that turn out not to be as robust as we had hoped, or we may need to think about redesigning our cities to be smarter cities in ways that would require much faster rejuvenation than we had planned for. So that's going to require money, it's going to require forethought, it's going to require rethinking policies like how we cover insurance or don't cover areas in terms of flood insurance or catastrophic insurance, creating new risk pooling mechanisms. So this is an area where we really have to think about all the pieces of the puzzle. The good news is, unlike a number of parts of the world that are extremely poor or have very few resources, Florida is a very rich state, and rich in both human capital as well as economic capital. So I think it has a real opportunity to leapfrog ahead in this area.
Well, I'm so happy when you were last year, you were connecting with climate tech entrepreneurs, because it really does feel like a scene is really emerging here and leaning into South Florida's vulnerability and trying to make it a place where we're really developing solutions. In this transition, it was last year, you wrote, how billions are pouring into the business of decarbonization. I mean, essentially what we're talking about here is a total addressable market. That is the entire economy. We're already seeing a transition right now in the auto industry as one example. Could you give us a sense of what are the sort of the first places we're seeing this transition? And as we move along, what are those places, those parts of the economy that are anticipated to be much slower and harder to make the transition?
Sure. In fact, I would even double down on your point about billions, and even the story I wrote a year ago for The Economist about the revival of climate tech on the sort of the heels of the earlier clean tech boom that a lot of your listeners and viewers would remember, led by Vinod Khosla, John Doerr, some of the giants of Silicon Valley. That kind of fizzled out. They were maybe too far ahead of their time 15 years ago and 10 years ago. But now, rebranded as climate tech, it's really found its moment and really attracting a lot of capital. Right now, the real story is not just of that early stage capital coming in. What's really different this time is that a number of the technologies are further along, meaning more mature. A number of the teams that have been involved are now veteran, multi-startup experienced entrepreneurs, and therefore more seasoned and ready to handle bigger companies. And therefore, we're entering a phase that goes from early stage to growth to really scale up. We're now talking about going from small scale to billion, but really to 10 billion and $100 billion companies and industries. That's the stage we're at, and that's very exciting.
Wow.
You're getting new kinds of capital coming in. Of course, private equity. We have a number of private equity funds that have now come in providing later stage capital. And so you suddenly have a new flood of money. And with the new laws that have been passed in the last months, the IRA, which is the climate change bill called the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's really about $369 billion for climate change and related infrastructure. The CHIPS plus Science law, which has a lot of money for innovation. And of course, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which has a significant amount of money for energy-related technologies, and among them, you see early sectors like electric vehicles, EV charging. You'd asked about what are some of the early sectors. It's going to be,
what are those places?
No doubt, anything to do with electrification, and in particular vehicles, and also the power sector. Massive amounts of support for green energy on the grid. And so those are going to be two early winners from the federal support and the private capital that it attracts, because we're anticipating there could be 5 or 10x the volume of federal subsidies or tax breaks that are attracted to this from private sector investors. And so I think that's the kind of volume of money. So suddenly you're talking not hundreds of billions, but potentially trillion or more in capital coming to green energy areas, because we've got the bottleneck in Washington has finally been released. That is, we have multiple points of legislation with significant resources, and they're on a pretty short fuse before the end of this decade, starting quite quickly. And that is finally given the signal to the markets that America is getting serious about climate change. And that's really the only signal that was needed, because most of the rest of the ecosystem, from bottom-up entrepreneurship to corporates needing to act on net zero, to investors looking for places to put into green or ESG climate-related opportunities, I think you're seeing a tipping point. We're going to see a massive investment boom. And I would even posit that it's going to be going against the grain of what is a financial market downturn, possible recession, certainly a high interest rate environment. Traditional VC may be entering a winter at this point in its cycle of funding. And despite that, I think we might very well see this train leave the station.
Wow. So as we think about sort of how our economy will shift, first areas, how we get around, where we get our power from, and then further down the road, how we produce our food, how we manufacture things, how we cool and heat our homes and places of work. Is that sort of a
that's a good
fair
sequencing
way to think about
I think there are sectors that are known by climate nerds as the hard to abate sectors, because they're hard to do.
What are those?
And so those will come a little bit later, among other things, the steel industry, cement, a lot of heavy industry, long distance transportation, whether that's on the roads or whether that's shipping by sea, maritime. These are hard things to substitute where the existing fuel, fossil fuels, are very energy dense. Refueling time is very quick. It's quite hard to replace with windmills and Teslas, right? So if you think of it that way, the first things that'll get swapped out in this green transition are things that windmills and Teslas can take care of. On the other hand, you can't solve that problem at a steel plant. The way that steel blast furnaces work, you actually need the hydrocarbons as part of the chemical process of making steel, for example. And similarly, making cement in the traditional way, it's intrinsic to the process to release carbon dioxide. And so we have to find quite different alternatives. As it so happens, making hydrogen from renewable energy, or if you make it from natural gas, then sequestering and capturing and storing the CO2 that's associated with it. One's called green hydrogen, one's called blue hydrogen. One of these pathways can actually have a big role in swapping out for fossil fuel use in industrial uses. And the legislation that's been passed has a huge amount of money to create 4 hydrogen hubs in America. 4 of them will be named by law, where there's going to be multi-billion-dollar investments into getting into the hydrogen economy. And America has now put down a marker that we intend to lead this race.
Is most of the technology that we need, the innovations that we need, there, or is a whole lot more required?
So this is a politically fraught topic. And John Kerry, before the last UN summit a year ago, this is the U.S. government's climate envoy at the moment, former Secretary of State, he said, we need innovation to solve the climate problem. And that might seem uncontroversial to folks who, follow this, or maybe who are just innocent bystanders. But he got in a huge political fight, being attacked by a lot of environmentalists who said, wait a minute, you can't say that. We have everything we need. We need to roll out wind and solar faster, and let's have more EVs. How could you possibly say we need innovation to solve climate? Because there's a fight amongst the nerds in this world of climate that say, if you support innovation and say that we need to invest in something new, then you're against rapid deployment of what we already have. And so there's sort of a zero-sum mindset. And they have some reason to fight this, because they think that they see that the oil companies, for example, often dangle a shiny carrot way off in the future. So hydrogen will save us all. And in fact, they're using it as an excuse not to do anything. They're using it as an excuse to block investments in clean tech and now climate tech and so on. So there is a bit of a political game here. That's what the lobbyists are responding to. If you step back from all of it, the bottom line is we need both. And frankly, even going much more aggressively, deploying what we have in terms of wind, solar, grid scale batteries, which need to be scaled up, all of the charging networks, we can roll a lot of this out. Just look at China, almost 40% of the new vehicles are EVs, and the supporting infrastructure is being rolled out very rapidly. So we know we can do this. But to get to those hard to decarbonize industries, we don't yet know how to make steel cost effectively from using renewable inputs like green hydrogen. It's way too expensive, and nobody would buy it at that price, or very few people would buy it. It's not competitive. And so that's the kind of innovation we're going to need in the 2030s and 2040s, meaning not in the next 10 years, but after that, we're going to tap out on what we can do without cracking the code on some of these breakthrough technologies, maybe even some kind of advanced small modular fusion reactors. I mean, I've heard that story before. I'm skeptical, but hey, I want us to invest in all of it, especially with private capital, because we're going to need some of those Hail Mary passes to come through, including direct air capture, sucking carbon out of the air. That's one of these things that we're going to need. And the scientists have come around to the view that we have to have it. Otherwise, we're never going to achieve some of the goals on climate.
As we think about climate tech and climate innovation, what are those places that have distinguished themselves as company builders of these next generation climate tech companies?
Well,
or is it, it's all over the country, all over the world?
This is the thing. The innovation happens, but it doesn't tend to be spread like jam everywhere equally, right? And that's because of the clustering effects. We know how innovation tends to work when really sparky people, often from different fields, maybe adjacent fields, maybe totally disparate fields, they come together. It was the coffee house effect 500 years ago in London, right? That led to a lot of interesting business model innovations that came out of that era in capitalism. And like that, Silicon Valley had the benefit of that over the last 50 years. Climate is a much more complicated, much richer, much more interesting problem than that. And that's why it opens up the opportunity for hard engineering. If you look up in Boston, I'm an MIT grad myself, and they've done a great job in the Boston cluster, for example, where they're working on the harder engineering problems involved with deep tech. And there, how do you deal with the issues of that new kinds of novel metals, right? How do you get rare earths out of the ground in an environmentally friendly way rather than an environmentally toxic way, which is how it's currently done in many places? Because if we can solve that problem effectively, the things to watch are in the developing world, where the use cases are most important. So sea level rise, you're going to see very interesting developments from low-lying countries where you may well see technologies that might be developed in other countries. There's a very interesting innovator out of Miami working on novel seawalls that I met during my last visit. But the
Yeah,
applications
sure,
of
Anya.
right, and
Yeah,
it will be
yeah,
known to your listeners and viewers. But I
yeah.
think the applications of those could well be many developing countries might be willing to pilot it because they face an existential threat. And so they may be able to fast track permitting, for example, for trials, or get development bank funding because there's a lot of resiliency funding now coming in through philanthropic and donor agencies. So you're seeing new kinds of innovative financing supporting innovation in these kinds of areas, more related to resilience and adaptation, let's say, and more focused on Africa and agriculture, for example, because we know what a human tragedy is waiting to happen if we don't intervene. So I think we're seeing new hotbeds of innovation emerging for different types of innovation within climate, because it's such a huge area, climate tech innovation.
Obviously, here in Miami, you got a taste of it. There's a budding climate tech scene, whether it's business leaders, startups, policymakers. What are the different things that you've seen work well elsewhere to try and create what you talked about, that cluster effect, so places that haven't historically been leaders in innovation can be leaders in this next
Yeah, I think thinking about different parts of the ecosystem, right? So you touched on a couple of them. Having a public policy apparatus that's not only supportive but proactive. Dealing with climate change is not really a problem that financial investors normally think about, unless you say, "Hey, this is probably going to be someone's willing to pay for it, so we'll do this. Let's build the stilts so people can put their houses up on it, and they'll pay for the stilts." Or you say there's going to be a regulation. We're not going to be allowed to burn coal, so hey, let's come up with something that's not dirty because there's going to be a regulation banning existing stock and legacy assets are going to go out of business, right? So regulators, and in the case of cities or regions, a coordinated sort of effort. That kind of coordination gives investors a lot more confidence that what they can do. But the second thing is actually allowing people to try and fail things. That's the hardest thing. And so having Singapore has done this very well in fintech, for example, having sandboxes, that is a regulatory permission to try things in a controlled way. And if it doesn't work, you're not going to be punished. As long as we learn the lessons the right way, you're declared why you're trying something. And similarly, financial investors also get it, right? We know venture capitalists are used to failure, but they have a very narrow window and they want a quick path to profitability unless you bring in some slightly later stage capital. And that might involve maybe a government co-financing of that bridge finance. Have a private equity investor or a local corporate ready to say, hey, we'll join the incubator. We're ready to support this. We understand some of these are going to fail, but we want to learn. In other words, you find a way to encourage an ecosystem that's willing to fail and allow that to be part of a resilient innovation system.
If this goes the way I think that we hope it goes, this transition, what will cities look like in 20 years? Is this cities of electric cars and car charging stations and dwellings with solar panels atop their atop roofs? What should we imagine cities, and let's take Miami where we are right now, if do this right, what will cities look like in 20 years?
That's a powerful question. Cities are phenomenal. Cities are the engines of human activity, of creativity. They're hubs and crucibles of innovation, right? And that's been true for really as long as humanity has been around. And so I think cities will still be here. That's part of the point I want to say unequivocally. The second thing is that I think cities can drive innovation if we do it right? That is bringing together people, connecting us in person, but also using digital technologies as we are today. I think that happens when in the spirit of the city. So we want to keep that alive, that flame alive. I think that's why cities will be here 20 years from now. Now, how we organize ourselves, one, you mitigate the risk. That is, you deal with if you're vulnerable to sea level rise. Obviously, as Miami, as you think about what you do about that, 20 years should give you enough time to get infrastructure together, to think about the longer term and think about alternatives for your people. But the third thing is, how do you turn this to, the green eco living city of the future, right? And there we have some models from around the world. You may very well have cities with zero emission zones, right? That is, at the moment, we have a number of cities around the world that have some kind of fee you have to pay to come into city center. Manhattan is probably going to introduce one of these. They call it a congestion tax in other parts of the world. But there's a serious proposals in Europe to have no cars at all or zero emission cars only in the city, zero emission vehicles, right? Basically, that means electric in the short term, hydrogen fuel cell buses, maybe, something like that can pass the test of zero emissions. And forget climate. That's going to be the biggest win for human health, because nasty diesel emissions, we know the environmental justice components of this, right? Here in New York City, the lion's share of the dirty diesel bus depots, refueling depots, and where buses stop are in Harlem, are in the poor neighborhoods. And so we have to really search, deep in our souls and say, what kind of cities do we want? And different cities will make different choices, to be honest. And there'll be some cities that are basically exurban sprawl cities where you're not going to see the greenest choices, where their water is subsidized, for example, where there's a lot of McMansions. I would hope that over time we would at least price those resources properly, rather than subsidizing those as we do in many parts of the world. If we get resource prices right, we're much more likely to see different patterns of development. And including, I would say, on the last point on this, if we stop subsidizing people to live in parts of our country and the world where they're in harm's way. And hurricanes are one example, but as well, other ways in which we misprice or underprice risk insurance. I think that signal is very powerful. And at the moment, we're actually providing a perverse incentive through state-sponsored insurance and so on for people to live in dangerous places. We should do the opposite.
Well, you hit on one there as we close that is very important here in Florida. We always like to end with sort of 3 takeaways. And as we think about this transition, which you talk to people every day about it, but there are lots of people across Miami, lots of people in cities around the world who they're not thinking about the transition to net zero on a daily basis. What should be top of mind? Is it, no one's going to be left out, that this is a generational opportunity for businesses and entrepreneurs? What are those things that should be top of mind?
The first is that there are, this is here to stay, right? Should anyone have doubted it, that this is going to be the mega trend of our lifetimes, and really our children's lifetimes too, that is dealing with what climate change brings our way. We can no longer afford a sort of an ignorant, lazy opinion on it. If you want to, you need to get smart on it, spend some time, read some books, talk to people who are expert in the subject, and understand how it relates to the way you live your lives, the direction your career is going. If you're on the wrong side of where trends are going, you may very well find your industry or your job out of existence, right? And that's really what happens, is sometimes we cross a line where change comes quite rapidly. And I would predict that because when the US gets serious about something, we tend to move pretty quickly, right? Much more than other major economies. And I sense, having followed this for a couple of decades now, and having advocated for this kind of change, and it didn't happen for a very long time. And Europe tried, but Europe is not America, right? Europe has no energy resources to start, not much anyway to speak of. It's a big importer, whereas the US is both the energy superpower of the world with dirty energy and clean energy, but also the innovation superpower of the world. And we are very market oriented, right? We're a capitalist country. We're unashamed about it, and we're going to make money on it. And now it's suddenly aligning in such a way that we can show people how we're going to make money on it. We're going to be the energy superpower that serves the world. That's what's going to happen, I predict. And along the way, we're going to crack some eggs to make this omelet, and some people are going to lose their livelihoods, or some industries are going to fall by the wayside that are not able to be demonstrating that they're climate consistent, that they're on the right side of history. And that how we deal with that, I think you need to keep your eyes wide open as an individual, as a listener. Look for those opportunities and make the modifications that you need to, but also watch and look for those that might suffer. And we need to make sure the communities where coal is going to be probably going out of business, let's make sure we take care of them in the way that we did not when we introduced NAFTA or globalization. Take care of the communities in industrial areas that were going to lose their jobs. We said we would, but we never did. We were never serious about it. And we lost a generation, and more than that, we lost the political support for what is, broadly speaking, a good thing, a connected world where we exchange ideas, people, goods, trade. The world has always been wealthier. America has always been wealthier when we led on globalization rather than retreated into our shell. And that's a lesson not to repeat with climate. And the way to do that is to bring communities along to think about the losers as well as the winners and make sure that there's dignity and pathways to prosper as we do the climate transition.
Wow, this has been terrific. Vijay, thank you very much for the time. I hope you don't mind if now and then we check in as Miami is in its own right, embarking on this transition that, as you said, is going to be, part of our lives throughout our entire lives. So thank you very much.
No, it's a great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to keeping in touch with what you and Miami comes up with.
Opportunity Miami is powered by the Miami-Dade Beacon Council. This episode was produced by your editorial manager, Suzette Leboy, with special thanks to Clutch Content Partners. You can reach us with your story ideas and feedback at next@opportunity.miami. Thanks so much for joining us.